for the invitation. And yeah, maybe in the future, actually, I'll do something comparing the second generation, the Welsh second generation England with Welsh language writers in Patagonia, because actually I think there are very interesting similarities between Welsh language writers from Patagonia and maybe somebody like Jaiglyn Davis, for example, from Toxteth in Liverpool. But that's for another day. And my apologies and slight embarrassment, of course, for doing this in English. The truth is, I'd written Hanes Cymru and I was knackered. I didn't think, I just wanted to switch language. When you switch languages, sometimes you have new ideas. So that's why I've done this today. But I begin by saying that the 20-minute paper, the staple of the academic conference, it's an odd beast, isn't it? Because it's quite difficult to do justice with 3 or 4 years research in a short period of time. It's a problem I faced myself in the past, but it's not going to be one I'm going to face today. Because the point of this paper is actually quite simple. It's merely to point out the growth of negative attitudes among many in the Welsh independence movement, and specifically on the left of the Welsh independence movement towards the Welsh inheritance in Patagonia. So the paper will be short, and in many ways it's an aside to the conference. But nevertheless, it is an important point to make, I think, and that's why I'd like to make it. Now, over the past 4 or 5 years, the Welsh public sphere has migrated from paper sources, such as books and articles, which by and large have been mediated by so-called experts in the field, academics, editors, and the like, to social media, and specifically to Twitter. Now, this has had a number of effects. One has been the democratization of debate. Anyone can speak, and their voice does not need to be mediated. But it has also changed debate in other ways. In the field of Welsh studies, it has led to rapid Anglicisation, both in terms of decreased use of the Welsh language and also the displacement of Welsh historiography and cultural and literary theory by norms imposed on the Welsh language community from without. In essence, it has meant the displacing of the internal debate of the Welsh language community by that of the Anglophone Twitter sphere. A form of knowledge underpins that Anglophone Twitter sphere in Wales. It is that of epistemologies from America and England, which are imported to Wales via social media. On social media in Wales, these Anglophone academic viewpoints are simplified and popularized, and they become tropes. These tropes are then recycled and applied to debate in a reductive way. Furthermore, these tropes are applied in a way that try to close out other voices from debate, often via personal attacks and abuse. Now, these latter campaigns rarely work in the sense that people are prevented from publishing, but it is obvious that they set the tone for possible social and intellectual ostracism. So consider, for example, the 2020 article by the Patagonian author Geraldine McBurney-Jones for the website Nation Cymru. Why the Wladfa shouldn't be called a colonialist venture, which elicited many responses, which I put on the paper in front of me, but which I'm not going to say now because they contain a large number of 4-letter swear words, and which I find to interpret in any way as actually being a means of harassment and bullying. Now, the problem with online behavior of this type in order to enforce an intellectual orthodoxy has been discussed at great length in the Anglosphere and it is not my intention to repeat these points. Nevertheless, that this should happen in a debate on Patagonia and be directed by people in Wales towards a Patagonian is a matter of real concern. And it is that sort of antipathy on the part of leftist Anglophone thought in Wales today towards the Patagonian inheritance, which I wish to explore. The history of the Welsh as a stateless nation, as an ethnic minority group within the island of Britain, and Welsh as a minority language with a nevertheless global reach, means that Welsh language historiography and theory contains at the heart of its intellectual canon a number of theoretical standpoints which differ from Anglophone norms. Among these is the assertion, absolutely central to Welsh thought, that the Welsh are a displaced group indigenous to the island of Britain, and with claims, therefore, in part at least, on indigeneity. This is often buttressed by the argument that the Welsh were subjugated by the English in a manner synonymous with what later societies called colonialism and colonization. Many of these assumptions within the Welsh language intellectual tradition influenced Welsh thinking about Oladva. It is striking, for example, that despite their dependence, like all European cultures, on racist and racialized tropes, Welsh language writing on Patagonia also employed metaphors and narratives which celebrated the indigenous. Within the Anglosphere, these views, which are central to the Welsh language intellectual tradition, are by and large ignored or dismissed. They are not taken seriously, or they are regarded as irrational. Yet the role they play in the psychological life of the Welsh language community is important. The reason why Welsh speakers in Wales became so obsessed with Patagonia is because it represented a symbolic victory over their own subjugation. Whatever the facts on the ground in Patagonia itself, the Patagonian venture was regarded in Welsh intellectual circles as a reaffirmation of Welsh language sovereignty. It achieved something which could never be done in Britain itself, where the Welsh were very much an ethnic underclass. For the Welsh intellectuals who launched the project, Oladva was a utopian return to emancipation. It was a symbolic return to the island of Britain before it had been removed by their own oppressors. Of course, these Welsh takes on the Patagonian project have to be understood within the context of European colonization, and racist and racialized discourses and practices which were part of whiteness. But within the overarching reality of European supremacy, the Welsh response to colonization within its own intellectual tradition was radically different to that of England. For unlike the Welsh-speaking world, the Anglophone world had never been powerless. It had never lacked a state or states. It had never been colonized itself. And by and large, it rarely employed metaphors of the indigenous, preferring instead to justify colonialism within progressive circles as an exercise in liberal universalism. The Welsh also made appeals to universalism in order to justify the colonial exercise. For example, in their promotion of Christianity as a universal creed. But salvation for the Welsh took a particularist form too, namely freedom from oppression. However, Recent debate in the public sphere in Wales on social media reflects little on this, and there is a lot of debate in the public sphere in Wales about Patagonia. In that debate, there is no recognition of Welsh language scholarship. Rather, it picks up contemporary debates about colonialism within the Anglosphere and applies this context to Oladfa. In this interpretation, Oladfa is a run-of-the-mill example of white European colonization complicit in the removal of the indigenous population. An act of racism, it is deeply immoral and cannot and should not be celebrated. Attempts to celebrate the landing of the Mimosa in 1865 are forms of denial which perpetuate racist and colonial violence. And of course, it is true to say that Oladfa is indeed a form of white settler colonialism. But this does not increase understanding of why Oladfa is a motive for Welsh speakers. Oladfa represents at the symbolic level the restoration of Welsh sovereignty, and thus to repudiate Oladfa means to repudiate the solidarity which that symbol represents. Oladfa means more in Wales than an Anglophone settler colony like New Zealand does in England. Questioning the existence of New Zealand does not entail the symbolic denial of the Anglophone world. And if New Zealanders were to accept that they had been party to a racist project, this would not lead to the invalidation of Anglophone culture in New Zealand, nor indeed in England either. Now, it is not my intention to deny the veracity of the argument that Oladfa is an example of Welsh settler colonialism. The difficulty is how this observation has led to claims that the Welsh inheritance of Patagonia should not be celebrated. Continually questioning in either explicit or implicit ways the rights of Welsh speakers and those of Welsh identities in both Wales and Trabwt to celebrate the heritage of Welsh language culture in Patagonia has become a staple of popular discourse about Oladfa on left-wing social media in Wales. So you can have a quick trawl on social media, on Twitter, as I did in fact yesterday, and you can throw up hundreds of statements. I've just picked a few out for you now. For example, it's 2020 and people still defend colonialism. It shouldn't be a debate. Colonialism shouldn't be celebrated or tolerated, even if they speak Welsh. Or for example, before reading this, I'm ashamed to say Patagonia was an anomaly in my thoughts about colonialism. Oladfa is often framed as a triumphant escape from British rule, a Welsh adventure into a distant wasteland. And isn't it amazing that the Welsh language is spoken in Argentina? Or I've even seen some Welsh nationalists celebrate the Welsh colonization in Patagonia. Nigel Farage would be proud of some of the tweets I've seen recently. Or, hey, I want Wales to get more money out of Westminster as much as anyone, but we have to come to terms with our responsibility in colonialism and stop banging on about Patagonia before we start asking for reparations. Wales is not yet anti-racist and this needs to be addressed. Or, colonialism doesn't need celebrating, lads. Or, I think perhaps it is time for Welsh people to recognise and stop glorifying the colonisation of Patagonia. I myself would like to apologise for my lack of education and lack of understanding whilst I went there with the Earth trip. Although to be fair to the author of that tweet, she does then proceed in supplementary comments to talk about the validity of dual heritage. Now, there are hundreds of tweets in this vein in Wales, and much other besides, including a petition discussed in the Welsh Parliament recently, which states as follows: Wales's colonisation of Patagonia must be introduced into the curriculum. It is taught to be a beautiful unity of two countries, worlds apart, when in reality it erases civil rights history. It was always taught as a means to keep the Welsh language alive by introducing it to a South American country, when in reality, Welsh people were introduced to Patagonia to civilized communities, which derives from racist ideologies which don't get taught at school. Now, this argument, questioning the Welsh and Welsh language presence in Patagonia, is facilitated too by a second form of politics in Wales. The most important discourse framing debate on left-wing social media in Wales today is support for independence, for Welsh independence. Enthusiasm for this amongst young left-wing tweeters in Wales is taken as a given. The politics of independence defines the Welsh nation as based on the territory of Wales. Membership of the nation is narrated by civic nationalism, which argues that Welshness pertains to the construction of civic structures within a defined territory, and all that who reside on that territory are Welsh. Now, this is important, of course, because it permits membership of the nation for those who reside in Wales to be defined in a way which is not ethnocentric. However, the civic definition of a national belonging promoted by the independence movement excludes from definitions of Welshness members of the Welsh diaspora who live outside Wales. In comments made about members of the Welsh community of England, a multi-generational Welsh community outside Wales, defined by ethnic self-consciousness rather than civic citizenship, civic nationalist discourse in Wales has posited arguments such as that Welsh ethnicity does not exist, that the Welsh in England cannot constitute an ethnic minority group, that English-born members of the Welsh community in England are not Welsh, and that the Welsh as a minority group, as a matter of principle, have never and cannot face either racism or xenophobia. Thus, civic nationalism, while it strives to be inclusive of identities within Wales, has a tendency to be exclusive of those with Welsh or partially Welsh identities from outside Wales who live outside Wales. Civic nationalism undermines the right of the Welsh diaspora to enjoy autonomy from the territory of Wales and to be Welsh in their own way. Now, both of these discourses, the settler colony discourse and the civic nationalist discourse, have combined in the case of Oladfa. Both discourses follow a dual strategy of delegitimizing the Welsh and Welsh language presence in Patagonia, while simultaneously positioning the Welsh presence in Wales to be authentic. The Welsh in Wales have the ethical right to continue to exist as a community, and indeed the emphasis on independence suggests that this is a political priority. But the Welsh diaspora is regarded as an alien presence in a place where the Welsh should not dwell. And the Welsh there are portrayed in negative terms, be that as social snobs via the caricature of Dic Sion Dafydd in the case of the Welsh in England, or as racists in the case of the Welsh in Patagonia. This has engendered a dramatic shift in attitudes towards Oladfa on the nationalist left in Wales. What was once a matter of pride is now a matter of regret and shame. And there is also an element of projection too. Civic nationalists, by making Patagonia the most oft discussed example of Welsh racism, with the exception of the slave trade, can in effect export the responsibility for Welsh racism out of Wales and transfer it to the diaspora. This form of cultural politics does, to me, seem to have the potential to be both prejudicial and discriminatory. The Welsh in Wales are not required to give up what is dear to them, namely the politics of an independent Welsh state, in order to atone for the crimes of their forefathers. However, may expect Welsh communities in other parts of the world to be ashamed of their identity and indeed openly question whether these Welsh identities outside Wales should be afforded the luxury of existence. Furthermore, this right to exist is not denied to other groups. As we have already noted, leftist discourse does not question the right to enjoy English language culture in the USA or Australia or New Zealand. Yet, celebration of Welsh language culture within Argentina today is challenged. That is to say, the Welsh language as a language operates as a marker within Anglophone discourse for the crime of colonialism, while the English language within Anglophone discourse does not operate as a marker for the crime of colonialism. The argument that Patagonia was colonized by white settlers from a European country called Wales is a historical truth. It is also true that their relationship with the indigenous population was defined by Victorian concepts of civilization that depended on racist and racialized social categories and power relationships. But the edifice of social commentary that has been built on this fact within civic nationalist and leftist discourse in Wales over the past 3 or 4 years or so is not a fact, but a discourse. This discourse runs the risk of stigmatizing a minoritized, multi-ethnic and multiracial language community in the global South, and scholars and activists and political campaigners in Wales need to reflect on this possibility. There is something quasi-colonial about a nationalist movement in Wales, telling people in Patagonia they should not be allowed to celebrate their cultural inheritance. Academic work on Welsh colonization in Patagonia should continue, as should public debate. But this should not be used by Welsh people in Wales to suggest, either explicitly or implicitly, that the Welsh cultural presence in Patagonia today is somehow illegitimate and undeserving of respect. Diolch yn fawr iawn.